The night sky over Europe, in 1941, was supposed to belong to the Luftwaffe. To the German High Command, their bombers and fighters were the lords of darkness, prowling unchallenged. Anything else was, in their words, insignificant. And so, when whispers reached Berlin of a new American twin-engine bomber, the A-20 Havoc, the generals smirked. They saw a short-legged nuisance, a toy hardly worth mentioning in their grand chess match of Blitzkrieg and Reich defense. But history, as it often does, enjoys embarrassing those who sneer. The Havoc did not arrive with trumpets or fanfare. It slipped quietly into the war, small, squat, and overlooked. Yet, like a mosquito buzzing around a sleepless man's ear, it became impossible to ignore. Low to the ground, beneath radar, hugging rivers and treetops, the Havoc stalked German supply lines in the black of night. What the generals mocked soon kept their soldiers awake in terror. Picture this: a frosty airfield in England. Ground crews huddle under dim lamps, the smell of gasoline thick in the air. Engines cough, then roar. A-20 crews strap in, young men with more courage than experience, about to trade sleep for fire and steel. Outside the cockpit glass, only darkness. No medals promised, no speeches guaranteed, just another night where survival itself is victory. And while the German High Command wrote dismissive memos by day, their troops cursed the very same aircraft by night. Railway stations shattered, convoys shredded, bridges collapsing in sudden eruptions of fire. The Havoc was no glamorous bomber, it was a blunt instrument wielded with surgical cruelty. The irony is delicious. A machine ridiculed in staff rooms ended up haunting the Reich in its most vulnerable hours. The lesson: never laugh too loudly at an enemy's tools, because one night, that buzzing nuisance may be the last thing you hear. And if you, dear listener, want to understand how forgotten machines like the A-20 reshaped the war, not in headlines, but in the shadows, then stay with us. Because this story is not about glory parades or famous dogfights. It is about the quiet nightmare that crept into German defenses when they least expected it. This is the story of the A-20 Havoc. And if you find yourself drawn into these untold chapters of history, don't just pass by. Join us, subscribe, and keep walking with us through the dim corridors of World War II, the ones where the echoes of propellers and explosions tell the truths that generals tried to ignore. The German High Command had a habit, a bad one. They loved to laugh. Not the warm laughter of soldiers sharing bread at the front, but the smug chuckle of men in polished boots, pointing at maps in well-lit rooms. In 1940 and 1941, they laughed at Britain's desperate night bombing attempts. They laughed at Soviet factories struggling to move east. And when the Americans arrived with a little twin-engine bomber called the A-20 Havoc, they laughed at that too. For them, war was supposed to be a theater of giants. Stukas diving, Messerschmitt streaking, Heinkel's blotting out the moon. The A-20. It looked almost comical. Too short to be graceful, too light to carry prestige, too fast to haul massive bomb loads, too small to inspire fear. A machine, they said, fit perhaps for reconnaissance or for scaring sheep in French meadows, but not for war against the Reich. Yet history punishes arrogance with exquisite timing. On the ground, German railway guards began scribbling night reports: explosion near rail yard, tracks damaged, casualties among sentries. Nothing too alarming, of course, at first. But then came the second report, then the third, then the 10th. Each filed away, each irritating like sand in a boot. The Havoc did not roar overhead in majestic waves. It whispered in the dark, pricking the Reich where it hurt most: supplies, fuel, sleep. One Luftwaffe officer, writing to his wife in 1942, put it in words the generals would not: "These small American machines, they come like thieves. Not enough to destroy Berlin, but enough to make us dread the nights. They arrive when the guards are tired, when the eyes burn, when we most wish to rest. It is not the damage, it is the interruption, the endless alarm." That was the true problem. The A-20 was not meant to win headlines. It was meant to be a mosquito. And a mosquito is never respected until the itching starts. Meanwhile, across the channel, the mood was far from smug. American crews were young, often undertrained, and painfully aware that their machines had been dismissed as second-rate. A pilot's diary from an English base reads, "They say the Germans laugh at our little Havocs. Well, good for them. They won't laugh when they're patching holes in their trains." Another added, more dryly, "If I die in this thing, at least I'll have annoyed them first." This was the heart of the problem for the Reich. They could not recalibrate their arrogance. To German planners, victory was a matter of tonnage dropped, cities flattened, enemy morale crushed in daylight. But the Havoc flipped the script. It didn't care about prestige. It cared about railway bridges at midnight, fuel dumps at dawn, columns of trucks caught in the wrong valley. Imagine a field commander in France, 1942. His men are exhausted from partisan ambushes by day. At night, just as he thinks he might rest, the air sirens wail. Out of the dark, an A-20 dives low, its engines snarling, bombs slamming into the convoy. Not a grand air raid, just enough to turn rest into panic. Morning comes with little sleep, less fuel, and fraying nerves. Multiply this across dozens of sectors, and suddenly the war machine wheezes. And still, in Berlin, the polished boots tap on the marble floor, the maps remain neat, and the chuckling continues. These little planes will never change the war. Oh, but they already had. The broader issue lay in perception. The Germans worshipped the doctrine of overwhelming force, tanks in mass, bombers in fleets, victories in weeks. They had no patience for a war of attrition in which tiny, persistent strikes bled resources dry. The Havoc was designed precisely for such a role, fast, nimble, relentless. And in dismissing it, the High Command blinded itself to the very kind of warfare that would eventually strangle them. To borrow a metaphor, the Reich expected to face lions, but it was the rats chewing the grain sacks that brought famine. Even Allied officers were surprised at first. When the Havoc arrived in European squadrons, expectations were low. One British officer described it as an honest aircraft, never brilliant, but always available. That, in itself, became a weapon. While larger bombers sat grounded by maintenance delays, the Havoc kept flying. Night after night, sortie after sortie, it accumulated not glory, but momentum. This quiet relentlessness became the central problem for German defense. Radar could miss it, flak guns often reacted too late, and the men on the ground learned to fear shadows more than sirens. A psychological shift took place. They began to imagine the Havoc everywhere, even when none flew. And therein lies the biting irony. The A-20 Havoc, dismissed as a nuisance, became not only a physical threat but a mental one. It was proof that sometimes the war is not won by what makes headlines, but by what robs the enemy of sleep. So the problem was simple and devastating. The Germans sneered at the Havoc, but the Havoc didn't care. It just kept flying. And every night it flew, the laughter in Berlin grew a little more hollow. The German High Command sneered at the A-20 Havoc, dismissing it as a footnote in aerial warfare. Yet, this unglamorous machine rewrote chapters of the conflict not with spectacle but with persistence. Night after night, its low-level raids gnawed at supply lines, morale, and the illusion of German invincibility. In the end, what Berlin mocked as a nuisance became a nightmare, a humbling reminder that arrogance is not a defense strategy. Let's untangle why a lowly A-20 could turn staffroom sneers into midnight panic. Start with the obvious. The A-20 was not designed to be glamorous. It was a compact, twin-engine attack aircraft built for work, short missions, frequent sorties, and blunt, precise violence on the ground. Where heavy four-engine bombers chased headlines with massed formations and ceremonial altitudes, the Havoc favored proximity, to the earth, to the target, and to the enemy's nerves. That design choice, simplicity and repeatability, was the first technical secret of its effectiveness. Think of aircraft design as menu choices. One menu serves a banquet, massive bombers, another serves relentless espresso shots, attack/light bomber types. The A-20 was an espresso machine. Its airframe favored ruggedness over comfort, a compact fuselage that reduced radar return and a structure tolerant of low-altitude stress. Because it was smaller and stiffer, crews could push it through treetop runs that would have shredded more delicate machines. This was not luck. It was engineering prioritizing survivability in the most uncomfortable of environments, close to the ground, under flak, and among the silhouettes of rail yards and convoys. Engines and reliability deserve a short, smug aside. Twin engines gave redundancy without gigantism. Lose one, and you could limp home. Lose both, and you had already joined the long roll call of dramatic headlines. The A-20's powerplant choices were practical. Enough thrust for fast climbs out of a target zone and quick acceleration to break an attack run. That punch meant the Havoc could appear, deliver, and vanish before heavier, slower interceptors brought their weight to bear. In plain language, it could get in and out faster than many defenders could tidy their medals and aim. Armament was where the A-20's modesty turned mean. Rather than a single monstrous bomb bay, many variants combined internal bombs with heavy, forward-facing guns in the nose. The nose-forward solution converted bombers into flying shotguns, excellent for strafing columns, smashing diesel tanks, and turning passenger coaches into scrap. When German soldiers later complained about something that hugged the ground and spat lead, they were describing, in pithy terms, this hybrid approach, a punch that combined explosive and ballistic damage at the point of contact. That versatility made each sortie a multi-tool of destruction, not a one-trick theatrical display. Navigation and night work sound romantic until you try them with cloud cover and a compass. The Havoc's crews excelled in the sullen science of dead reckoning and improvised navigation. They used what the era provided: limited onboard radio aids, ground beacons when available, and a lot of map work and stubbornness. The result: they could find a rail siding or a fuel dump in the dead of night without needing a spotlight. This human skill element amplified the aircraft's technical design. A practical plane plus skilled crews equals disproportionate results. Radar and detection are where the story gets delightfully ungainly for the high command. Contemporary radar systems were line-of-sight instruments. They hated curvature and loved altitude. Fly low, and you live in the shadow of the Earth itself. The A-20's low-level profile took advantage of the physics. Detection windows shrank, reaction time shortened, and the defender's flak often exploded uselessly above the real problem. In bureaucratic English, a technology optimized for big, high targets found itself blind to a persistent, low-slung nuisance. The generals had not paid the bill for this kind of warfare. Now a concise comparison, woven rather than boxed. Against medium and heavy bombers, the Havoc carried less payload per sortie but performed more sorties per night. Against fighters, it traded maneuverability for low-aspect survival and lightning missions. Against ground defenses, it converted advantages, small radar cross-section, robust structure, heavy forward guns, into repeated attrition instead of single spectacular wreckage. Put bluntly, the A-20 didn't win by a knockout, it won by 1,000 effective irritations. We should also note manufacturability and logistics, boring at staff meetings, lethal at 0-200 hours. The A-20 was easier and quicker to produce and maintain compared to larger aircraft. Shorter turnarounds meant more sorties per airframe per week. That operational tempo compounded the psychological effect. When the enemy sees repeated, regular harassment instead of occasional grand attacks, they don't merely count losses, they start to count sleepless nights. And counting sleepless nights is the start of surrendering initiative. Finally, let's demand honesty from doctrine. Technical design is one half of a coin, doctrine is the other. The Germans built doctrine around massed effects and decisive blows. They had little appetite for a war of micro-attacks chipping away at supply. This mismatch, sound technical design by the Allies versus a doctrinal blind spot by Berlin, made the Havoc's real mechanism of disruption as much political as mechanical. The Havoc exploited a human error, the belief that only grand gestures alter wars. If the first half was about why the A-20's design philosophy mattered, the second half must savor the delicious irony of numbers and what-ifs. Because generals love numbers, payloads, speeds, ranges, until those numbers are used to mock their own blindness. Start with payload. The A-20 Havoc typically carried around 2,000 pounds of bombs. The B-17, that flying cathedral of Allied propaganda, lugged 4 times as much. On paper, this looked like the end of the debate. Bigger is better, case closed. Except the Havoc could deliver that modest 2,000 pounds several times a night, at treetop level, directly onto the bridge or depot that mattered. The B-17 might drop its tons somewhere near a city. The A-20 would shatter the actual rail junction feeding German tanks. Which is the greater strategic insult, a skyline scarred or a fuel line cut? Berlin preferred the former, the Allies discovered the latter. Then there is speed. The Havoc cruised at roughly 300 miles per hour and could dash faster. That meant it was not much slower than German fighters designed specifically for interception. Combine this speed with low-level tactics, and the Havoc was like an uninvited dinner guest who not only arrived early but also left before you could prepare an excuse. German flak batteries often fired too high. Fighters scrambled too late. This was not accidental, it was physics weaponized. Range was admittedly limited. Around 1,000 miles depending on load, far less than a heavy bomber. But that limitation fit the geography of Western Europe like a glove. Shorter legs meant faster turnaround from English bases to French or Belgian targets. What the Reich dismissed as weakness was in fact optimization. Why cross oceans when your prey is just across the channel? Now consider adaptability. The Havoc could be converted into a night fighter with radar in its nose, or into a gunship bristling with 20mm cannons, or into a torpedo bomber for naval strikes. This identity crisis horrified purists but delighted pragmatists. The same airframe filled gaps that German planners insisted required separate, specialized machines. In hindsight, Berlin's obsession with specialization looked elegant on blueprints but brittle in practice. Let's indulge in a what-if. Suppose the Germans had taken the Havoc seriously in 1941. They might have diverted more radar coverage to low-level defense, adjusted flak doctrine, or invested in night fighter squadrons earlier. The Mosquito and Havoc raids might have bled less. Supply chains could have remained smoother, morale firmer. Would it have changed the war's outcome? Likely not. The Reich had deeper rot. But it might have delayed the inevitable, bought months of illusion. Instead, they laughed, and each laugh was punctuated by another Havoc bombing a bridge. Numbers tell another sly story in maintenance. Reports from Allied bases often note that the A-20 required fewer hours of repair per flight hour than comparable bombers. This meant crews could keep machines flying with a rhythm that heavier aircraft simply could not sustain. To a commander, this looks like dull accounting. To a soldier trying to sleep near a rail yard, it meant terror came every night, not once a month. Even ergonomics played their part. Pilots praised the Havoc's handling, especially at low altitude. It was not a diva that demanded gentle hands, it was a street brawler that forgave rough flying. This mattered because the pilots were often young, green, and terrified. A forgiving machine turned novices into survivors. The Luftwaffe, in contrast, increasingly threw recruits into finicky machines demanding skill they didn't have. Arrogance builds exquisite tools. Necessity builds practical ones. Guess which lasts longer? Now, the Havoc was not invincible. Crews called it the Boston in British service, and more than a few Bostons never returned. Flak was still deadly, and engine fires unforgiving. But here is the sardonic twist. German propaganda never knew what to do with the losses. You cannot boast about shooting down insignificant nuisances without admitting they were a nuisance worth shooting down. Silence became the official line, which only deepened the irony as troops in the field cursed what their newspapers pretended did not exist. One last piece of technical ridicule: radar jamming. Later Havocs carried simple but effective countermeasures, confusing German sets already straining at low-level detection. Imagine the embarrassment: expensive systems, proud engineers, and the solution turns out to be a small bomber flying beneath the radar horizon, sometimes literally trailing chaff out the window. For a Reich obsessed with technical superiority, being undone by tin foil was an indignity almost poetic. So here is the mechanism in one sentence. The A-20 succeeded not by outmuscling the Reich, but by exploiting every blind spot, technical, tactical, and psychological, that arrogance left unguarded. The year was 1941, and the Havoc's entry into Europe was so quiet it almost embarrassed the Allies themselves. These were not grand squadrons parading across the sky, but a few modest machines slipping into the war as if sneaking into a party they had not been invited to. The German High Command, of course, paid them little mind. They were too busy admiring their Messerschmitts and Heinkels, too comfortable in their belief that only giants mattered in aerial war. And so, when the first Havocs crossed the Channel under cover of night, the Germans quite literally did not look down. That oversight proved costly. On a damp October evening, 2 A-20s flew so low across northern France that farmers later swore they could hear the engines rattling their windows before they saw the planes. The crews were young, barely trained for the unforgiving work of night navigation, but determined to make their mark. Their target was not a city or a fortress, but a railway yard tucked between hills, one of those unglamorous nodes that fed the German war machine with the efficiency of a bloodstream. At precisely the wrong hour for the defenders, bombs tumbled from the Havoc's bays and struck a munitions train. The resulting explosion shattered not just steel but the illusion of invulnerability. Villagers miles away recalled the sky turning red as though a second sunrise had arrived in the dead of night. Reports from the ground were reluctant to admit significance. A German officer noted tersely, "Enemy light bombers caused a delay in traffic. Casualties among guards." Delay, such an unremarkable word, and yet fatal in a war that ran on timetables. Every tank at the front depended on trains behind it, every truck on bridges, every soldier on rations delivered by night. The Germans would learn, again and again, that what seemed minor on paper grew malignant in practice. By early 1942, the pattern sharpened. Havocs became raiders of the road, predators of the night highway. German commanders had trusted the cover of darkness to protect their convoys. After all, Allied heavy bombers were clumsy at night, their formations scattering, their bombs falling wide. But the Havoc turned that logic on its head. Small groups of A-20s would roar suddenly along a road, their nose guns blazing, bombs dropped with cruel precision. Then they vanished before flak crews even finished their coffee. One French villager recalled watching from his barn as an entire convoy of fuel trucks erupted like candles snuffed by fire. The flames, he said, painted the clouds orange for hours. The Germans were forced into awkward contortions. They began moving convoys later, posting more guards, spreading columns thinner. None of it worked. The A-20 was too quick, too persistent, and too willing to strike again tomorrow. A Luftwaffe officer confessed in a letter that the men feared not the grand raids, but the buzzing devils that appeared without warning. He admitted that the damage was often small in material terms, but catastrophic for morale. "We dread the nights more than the days." Technically, the Havoc exploited every blind spot the Reich left exposed. Radar installations pointed their gaze toward high-flying bombers, not low-level intruders. Flak batteries were calibrated for altitude, wasting shells far above the real danger. Even the vaunted night fighters struggled to intercept machines flying so close to the ground, weaving among valleys and rivers where radar screens went dark. What the Germans called limitations, short-range, light bomb load, turned out to be a design optimized for exactly this style of harassment. The Havoc was a machine built not to shock once, but to bleed slowly. By mid-1942, its raids had multiplied. In northern France, a series of Havoc strikes crippled bridges across the Somme, forcing German logistics officers into humiliating detours. Local resistance fighters, emboldened by the disruption, noted that German patrols grew edgier, more prone to overreaction, sometimes firing into shadows. The Havoc's bombs did more than crater roads, they carved cracks into German confidence. And still, the High Command in Berlin sneered. To admit the nuisance was to admit vulnerability, and vulnerability did not fit their myth of supremacy. Official communiques downplayed the raids, dismissing them as isolated pinpricks. But the soldiers in the field were not laughing. They were staring into the dark, waiting for the next snarl of twin engines. The stage was set. What began as tentative raids in 1941 and 1942 was about to escalate into a systematic campaign. The Havoc had announced itself as more than an annoyance. It was becoming a strategy in its own right. The Germans had scoffed at mosquitoes, but by 1943 they would learn how much blood a swarm could drain. By 1943, the Havoc was no longer the awkward newcomer skulking in the shadows. It had matured into a tool of choice for missions that demanded speed, precision, and a willingness to fly low enough to clip treetops. The Allies had noticed something the Germans refused to admit. The Havoc was a perfect scalpel for the arteries of the Reich. The year began with raids that were small but steady, each one chipping away at the myth of German control. Supply lines through occupied France and Belgium became nightly hunting grounds. Entire squadrons of Havocs, now better trained and more confident, flew in pairs and fours, threading valleys, using rivers as guides, their shadows sliding along the ground like phantoms. Targets were no longer just trains and bridges, but also radar stations and coastal defenses. Each raid felt like a note in a mocking symphony, played for an audience that still insisted the music didn't exist. One operation near Amiens highlighted the shift. In February 1943, Havocs attacked a key rail junction under heavy guard. Searchlights clawed the night, flak barked furiously, yet the A-20s punched through, dropping bombs so accurately that 2 locomotives were left jackknifed on the tracks. The Germans reported the incident as minor disturbance, but photographs taken afterward revealed wreckage so severe that traffic was disrupted for weeks. One Allied pilot later quipped, "If that was minor, I'd hate to see major." The Germans' arrogance only deepened their humiliation. By clinging to the belief that such raids were strategically irrelevant, they ensured their defenses lagged. Night fighters remained concentrated around major cities and industrial hubs, leaving rural lifelines exposed. Radar operators were ordered to focus on high-altitude raids, ignoring blips too close to the ground. This doctrinal blindness allowed the Havocs to slip repeatedly through cracks that were never patched. Soldiers at the front, however, were not fooled. Letters intercepted by Allied intelligence reveal a different truth. One infantryman stationed near Lille wrote bitterly, "The Americans send small bombers every night. They are not dangerous to the city, but we cannot rest. Our officers tell us it is nothing, but it feels like everything." That gap between official narrative and lived experience grew into a chasm, eroding morale faster than any grand bombardment could. The Havoc also found new roles in 1943, adapted into night fighters and intruders. With radar equipment stuffed into their noses, some A-20s began prowling for German bombers and transport aircraft. Imagine the insult, a plane dismissed as too small to matter now hunting down the Reich's own machines in the dark. German crews described the shock of being ambushed mid-flight by what they had been told were toys. One navigator recalled, "We thought it was a mosquito. When they told us it was an American Havoc, we were ashamed." From a technical perspective, the Havoc's strengths were compounding. Crews had mastered the brutal art of low-level navigation, often timing attacks to coincide with changes of guard or moments when vigilance lapsed. Bomb loads remained modest, but precision turned each strike into a lever of disproportionate effect. A single destroyed bridge could halt an entire armored division for days. In an army addicted to speed, delays were poison. Perhaps the cruelest joke of 1943 was how invisible the campaign remained in German propaganda. To acknowledge the Havoc would be to admit vulnerability, so silence reigned in official communiques. Newspapers trumpeted victories on the Eastern Front while omitting the nightly harassment hollowing out the Reich's western lifelines. Yet among civilians and soldiers alike, the truth circulated in whispers. The small bombers were everywhere, and no one could predict when they would strike. By late summer, the Havoc had helped soften coastal defenses ahead of larger Allied operations. Gun emplacements, ammunition dumps, and troop barracks were all chewed up in persistent raids. The pattern was clear. Heavy bombers crushed cities, but Havocs shredded the sinews of war. The two approaches, once seen as incompatible, were now complementary. One provided spectacle, the other, exhaustion. And so the laughter in Berlin grew strained. By the autumn of 1943, some officers privately acknowledged the nuisance had become a genuine problem. Still, the official line remained dismissive. Pride forbade confession. But pride, as history often delights in proving, is a poor shield against shrapnel. The Havoc, once sneered at as insignificant, had become indispensable to the Allies and intolerable to the Germans. The stage was being set for even larger operations in which this toy would play a role that mocked every arrogant dismissal ever scribbled in a general's memo. By 1944, the Havoc had ceased to be a nuisance and had become a daily torment. The Germans, once so smug about their night fighters and radar, now faced an enemy that seemed to thrive in their blind spots. For the Allies, the Havoc was a workhorse, rarely glamorous, never the star of newsreels, but without its relentless raids, the stage for D-Day might never have been set so cleanly. In the months leading to June, Havocs were tasked with softening German defenses across northern France. Bridges collapsed in fiery splinters, rail junctions crumbled under precise blasts, and ammunition depots erupted like grotesque fireworks. The Germans, still pretending these were minor annoyances, began diverting valuable manpower to guard every bridge, every convoy, every depot. It was a losing game of whack-a-mole, except the mole had twin engines and a belly full of bombs. Take, for example, the attacks around Cannes in May 1944. Havoc swept low over the countryside, tearing into supply convoys headed for the coastal defenses. Survivors recalled chaos on the roads, trucks overturned, horses bolting, drivers abandoning vehicles in panic. One German officer wrote in his diary, "We prepare for the invasion, yet cannot move supplies without loss. The small American planes mock us nightly." Note the word mock. It was not chosen lightly. The Havoc seemed to ridicule German preparedness itself. Then came the night skies before D-Day. While heavy bombers thundered high above, drawing flak and spotlight beams, the Havocs slipped under the spectacle. Their role was cruelly simple: cut every artery feeding the Atlantic Wall. And they did so with persistence that bordered on sadistic. Small towns awoke to find their railway stations in ruins, bridges over rivers like the Orne and the Seine reduced to rubble, and fuel depots burning for days. Each raid felt less like an isolated strike and more like a slow tightening of the noose. On June 5, the night before Allied troops stormed Normandy, Havocs were out in force. Their targets were not grand cities but the humble threads of infrastructure that could have brought German reinforcements quickly to the beaches. Railway lines were slashed, junctions shattered, and convoys shredded. One French witness later recalled, "The great bombers made us tremble, but the small ones gave us hope. They hit the Germans where it hurt most." That testimony captured the contrast perfectly. Prestige bombers impressed the world, Havocs disarmed the Reich. German troops stationed inland found themselves delayed, misdirected, or stranded entirely. Panzer divisions that might have contested the landings more fiercely arrived late, their trains stopped or their fuel depots destroyed. Analysts after the war often pointed to the Havoc's raids as among the most effective in disrupting the German response. Yet at the time, the High Command still downplayed the impact, as though pride could somehow rebuild rail bridges overnight. The Normandy campaign provided the Havoc with its cruelest punchline. While Allied generals celebrated breakthroughs with headlines, the Havoc's crews returned to their huts exhausted, uncelebrated, and unglamorous. But their work had gnawed through the German logistical backbone so thoroughly that when the tanks rolled ashore, resistance cracked sooner than expected. In hindsight, it was a mosquito swarm that paved the way for the Lions. Through the summer of 1944, the torment continued. Havocs shadowed retreating German forces, hammering convoys along the roads of France. Retreat, already humiliating, became catastrophic when every column seemed to explode before reaching safety. A soldier captured after the Falaise pocket collapse bitterly remarked to his interrogators, "We feared the little bombers more than the big ones. The big ones destroyed cities, the little ones destroyed our chances." Technically, the Havoc had by now become even more efficient. Crews were veteran, navigation techniques sharpened, and coordination with resistance fighters improved. German defenses, stretched thin by the collapse of the front, grew even less capable of dealing with the low-level intruders. Radar screens buzzed with irrelevance while the real killers hugged the ground, unseen. By autumn, as Allied forces surged into Belgium, Havocs pressed their advantage. They were no longer content with cutting supply lines behind static fronts. Now they chased the Germans across their own retreat routes. Bridges into Germany itself began to fall under the same raids that had once plagued northern France. The Reich was shrinking, and with it, the illusion of control. The very planes once laughed off as trifles now gnawed at the Empire's bones. And through it all, the irony sharpened. The German High Command, which had dismissed the Havoc as beneath notice, now saw its war machine bleed nightly. They had underestimated the nuisance, and in doing so, had allowed it to become a nightmare. By the winter of 1944–45, Germany was bleeding from every artery. Its cities lay in ruins, its armies retreated on all fronts, and yet, night after night, the havoc still came. The plane once dismissed as a trifle was now a veteran tormentor, escorting the Reich into its twilight with the same persistence that had defined its entire war. In January 1945, as the Ardennes offensive collapsed, Havocs harassed retreating German columns with merciless efficiency. The great armored gamble of the Bulge had failed, but its withdrawal offered a feast. Convoys snaking through the forests of Belgium found themselves stalked by low-flying Havocs, their guns tearing into fuel trucks, their bombs scattering men and machines into smoking ditches. Survivors recalled the humiliation of retreat compounded by constant attack from aircraft so small and unworthy that Berlin had once refused even to acknowledge their existence. February brought the Rhine campaign. Havocs were tasked with smashing bridges and ferries along the river, denying the Germans their last natural defensive line. On foggy nights, they skimmed just above the water, engines echoing off the banks, before dropping explosives that sent spans tumbling into the currents. A captured German engineer bitterly confessed that his men spent more time rebuilding than fighting. The bridges fall faster than we can raise them. We fight the river, the bombs, and the laughter of the enemy all at once. As Allied armies surged into Germany proper, the Havoc was there, an unglamorous companion to victory. While heavy bombers obliterated cities in firestorms, Havocs prowled the countryside, smashing what remained of logistics. Small towns in the Ruhr and beyond awoke to find their rail yards in ashes, their depots gutted, their convoys shredded. German civilians, already weary of the endless bombings, came to loathe the particular snarl of the A-20's engines. Lower, closer, more intimate than the distant thunder of 1,000 bombers. The irony was complete. The aircraft the High Command had sneered at in 1941 was now among the last sounds German soldiers heard before surrender. It had never carried the glory of a Lancaster, nor the terrifying silhouette of a B-17, but it had carried out the war's most unrelenting work. Every night it flew, it robbed the Reich of rest, of fuel, of hope. Technically, by 1945 the Havoc was an old design, already being eclipsed by newer machines like the Mosquito and the A-26 Invader. Yet it remained useful precisely because it was reliable. Crews could depend on it to take off, strike, and return, night after night, in a war where predictability was rare. German defenses, stretched and broken, were powerless against the constant harassment. In the end, the Havoc did not need to be cutting edge, it needed only to be present. In April, as the Allies closed in on Berlin, Havocs still flew sorties. Their targets were almost pitiful by then, bridges already half collapsed, trains reduced to a handful of cars, convoys of horse-drawn wagons. And yet, even in this final chapter, the raids mattered. Every bomb delayed retreat, every strafing run thinned resistance, every explosion drove home the message that the Reich's end was both inevitable and deserved. There is a cruel poetry in this. The German High Command had begun the war laughing at the Havoc, mocking its small frame and modest bomb load. They ended the war hunted by it, their troops exhausted, their bridges fallen, their supply lines in tatters. Pride had blinded them, and pride cannot stop bullets or bombs. For the men who flew the Havoc, the end brought little fanfare. They returned to their huts, packed their gear, and prepared to go home. Their missions were rarely recorded in bold headlines, their raids overshadowed by the grand spectacles of heavy bombers. But they carried with them the knowledge that their small, nightly efforts had gnawed away at the Reich's strength until it collapsed. And perhaps that quiet satisfaction was the greater victory, to have been the mosquito that drained the giant. By May 1945, the Havoc's war in Europe was over. The laughter in Berlin had long since died, buried under rubble and silence. The nuisance had become a nightmare, and the nightmare had become a requiem. The tragedy of the German High Command was not merely that they underestimated the A-20 Havoc, it was that they built their entire worldview on underestimation. To them, war was a contest of giants. Fleets of heavy bombers blotting out the sun, armored spearheads tearing through continents, and colossal engines of war grinding everything in their path. In that worldview, the Havoc was nothing but a footnote, a machine too modest to alter the course of history. And that, precisely, was their fatal mistake. Compare the Havoc with the B-17 Flying Fortress, the darling of Allied propaganda. The Fortress carried 4 times the bomb load, bristled with defensive guns, and flew missions that filled newspaper headlines. It embodied spectacle, the kind of weapon that generals and politicians adored because it photographed so well. Yet for all its glory, the B-17 could be inaccurate, vulnerable to weather, and dependent on massive formations. The Havoc, by contrast, delivered less tonnage but more certainty. When it struck a bridge, the bridge fell. When it strafed a convoy, the convoy burned. Which was more demoralizing, the skyline ruined or the food and fuel cut off? Ask the German soldier in the mud, not the general in Berlin, and the answer becomes obvious. Or take the Lancaster, the British giant that turned Hamburg and Dresden into infernos. It was a terror weapon, a city killer. But Havocs played a different game, one of precision harassment. Their bombs did not rewrite maps but disrupted timetables, and in war, timetables are often worth more than skylines. German arrogance blinded them to this truth. They laughed at the mosquito because they could not imagine dying from 1,000 bites. Even within the Allies, comparisons sting with irony. The mosquito, the sleek wooden marvel, often overshadowed the Havoc. Historians loved to sing the mosquito's praises, its speed, its versatility, its elegance. Yet the Havoc performed many of the same roles, less beautifully but no less effectively. If the mosquito was a rapier, the Havoc was a hammer. Both were deadly, only one was sneered at. And somehow, it was the hammer that pounded the Reich's nerves night after night. German planners compounded their error by clinging to doctrine. They poured resources into high-altitude interceptors, elaborate flak belts, and radar networks calibrated for the heavy bomber threat. All the while, the Havoc slipped beneath their gaze. Their defensive strategy was a fortress built to repel giants, while small intruders crawled freely under the gate. To acknowledge this flaw would have required humility, and humility was a currency the Reich never traded in. The numbers alone tell the joke. The Havoc's payload, about 2,000 pounds, seemed paltry next to the 8,000 carried by a fortress. Yet a Havoc could fly multiple sorties in one night, with turnaround times that heavy bombers could only envy. Its speed, over 300 miles per hour, allowed it to evade defenses designed for lumbering giants. Its ruggedness forgave clumsy flying, making it an ideal mount for young crews thrown into combat with only weeks of training. In every category the Germans dismissed, the Havoc turned weakness into strength. Consider also the cost. A Havoc was cheaper, quicker to build, and easier to maintain than the 4-engine behemoths. In a war of attrition, those qualities mattered as much as performance. German arrogance was not merely tactical, it was economic. They assumed the Allies would waste resources on prestige machines, not invest in practical tools. And so when swarms of Havocs kept returning, night after night, Berlin had no satisfactory explanation. They had laughed at the mosquito, only to find the swarm multiplying. The most damning mistake, however, was psychological. By refusing to acknowledge the Havoc's impact, the High Command created a chasm between their narrative and their soldiers' reality. Troops in the field cursed the little bombers, lost sleep under their raids, and watched supply lines vanish in smoke. Yet their leaders insisted these attacks were insignificant. Nothing corrodes morale faster than being told your suffering does not exist. The Havoc became a symbol not just of Allied persistence, but of German denial. It is tempting to imagine an alternative history. What if the Germans had taken the Havoc seriously in 1941? What if they had recalibrated radar for low-level detection, trained more night fighters, or shifted doctrine toward defending logistics rather than prestige targets? Perhaps convoys would have moved more safely, bridges been repaired more quickly, fuel delivered more reliably. Perhaps the Reich might have lasted longer. But arrogance is stubborn, and by the time Berlin recognized the danger, the Havoc was already a nightly plague. And so the comparison becomes a cautionary tale. The Havoc was not the largest, nor the fastest, nor the most glamorous aircraft of the war. But it was effective, reliable, and persistent. The Germans failed not because they lacked weapons, but because they lacked imagination. They sneered at the wrong enemy. They defended against the lions while the rats ate their grain. They prepared for the storm but ignored the leak in the roof. And in the end, it was the leak that drowned them. If the Havoc's wartime service was defined by being underestimated, its post-war legacy was defined by being overlooked. History books, like generals, often prefer spectacles. They recount the firestorms of Dresden, the mushroom cloud over Hiroshima, the thunder of massed bomber streams. The Havoc rarely appears in these pages, as though the nightly torment it delivered was somehow too small to matter. And yet, the echoes of its engines linger in the lessons that strategists and historians cannot ignore. The immediate consequence for Germany was exhaustion. The Reich was strangled not only by the grand campaigns of heavy bombers but by the relentless interruptions of machines like the Havoc. Every destroyed bridge delayed reinforcements, every burned convoy slowed offensives, every sleepless night eroded morale. By 1944, German commanders admitted privately that they could not move a single train without risking attack. The very thing Berlin had dismissed as insignificant had become central to the Reich's collapse. But the true legacy extended beyond Germany's defeat. The Havoc proved that persistence, precision, and harassment could be as decisive as brute force. Future air doctrines absorbed this lesson with varying degrees of honesty. The Americans, never shy of spectacle, continued to build ever larger bombers, but they also invested in aircraft that mirrored the Havoc's philosophy: fast, versatile, able to strike surgically rather than theatrically. The A-26 Invader, which replaced the Havoc late in the war, carried forward its DNA: speed, adaptability, and an indifference to glory. For Britain, the lesson was confirmation of what they had already discovered with the Mosquito. Small, fast bombers could punch far above their weight. The Havoc reinforced the argument that elegance was optional, but results were mandatory. A wooden Mosquito or a stubby Havoc, the materials and aesthetics differed, but the principle was the same. The enemy's lifelines mattered more than its skylines. The Germans, of course, learned the lesson too late. Their obsession with prestige blinded them to practicality. They had invested heavily in massive projects like the V-2 rocket, hoping for miracle weapons to turn the tide, while dismissing the cumulative damage inflicted nightly by Havocs. In the post-war analysis, even surviving German officers admitted the oversight. One Luftwaffe commander remarked bitterly, "We were prepared for lions, but we were eaten by rats." Psychologically, the Havoc left scars deeper than its tonnage could explain. Veterans on both sides remembered the sound of its low-level approach, the sudden roar in the dark, the brief chaos, the silence afterward. German soldiers, deprived of sleep and plagued by uncertainty, carried those memories into captivity and beyond. Allied crews, though often denied the headlines given to Fortress or Lancaster pilots, remembered with grim pride that their small missions had punched above their weight. The Havoc became a symbol of the ordinary made extraordinary, not by scale, but by persistence. Its influence rippled into the Cold War as well. Military planners recognized that harassment and disruption could cripple even technologically superior foes. The Havoc's philosophy reappeared in doctrines of interdiction, close air support, and counterinsurgency. Aircraft like the A-10 Thunderbolt II, built decades later, carried the same DNA: rugged, unglamorous, but terrifying to those on the receiving end. The mosquito bite had become a recognized weapon of war. Yet history, with its preference for spectacle, still treated the Havoc like an afterthought. Museums displayed the B-17, the Lancaster, the Spitfire, icons of glory. Few bothered to preserve the A-20, fewer still to tell its story. It was as though the Allies themselves had inherited a touch of German arrogance, preferring to celebrate giants while ignoring the pests that actually drained the enemy dry. Perhaps that is fitting. The Havoc never sought glory, it sought effectiveness. Even in memory, it remains consistent, a nuisance, underestimated, and indispensable. The irony sharpens when one considers how modern analysts frame the war. They debate whether strategic bombing was effective, whether terror raids hastened Germany's defeat, whether the destruction of cities justified the cost. Meanwhile, the Havoc's contributions are beyond dispute. No one questions that destroyed bridges halted armies, that burned convoys starved divisions, that sleepless nights weakened men. While historians argue over the morality of firestorms, the Havoc's record stands quietly uncontroversial. It worked. Perhaps the most important lesson lies not in engineering or tactics but in humility. The Havoc is a reminder that dismissing an enemy's weapon because it appears small or ungainly is the surest path to disaster. Wars are not won by prestige or photographs. They are won by what keeps flying, what keeps striking, what keeps the enemy awake at night. In that sense, the Havoc is not merely an aircraft but a parable. In the end, the German High Command sneer was not just a misjudgment of an airplane, it was a symptom of their entire worldview. They believed in dominance by spectacle, in victory through intimidation, in weapons that impressed themselves more than they impressed the enemy. The Havoc, in its modest persistence, exposed the folly of that arrogance. Every bridge it dropped, every convoy it shattered, every soldier it robbed of sleep was another line in a cruel joke written by history itself. And so, the legacy endures, not in museums, not in headlines, but in the unglamorous doctrine of persistence. The Havoc proved that even the most modest machine, wielded with determination, could unmake an empire. The Germans laughed at it. Then they bled because of it. And in that contrast lies the real lesson, as relevant now as it was in 1945. Never underestimate the mosquito. The Havoc story ends not with fanfare, but with the quiet satisfaction of a job relentlessly done. In many ways, it is a parable for the entire war. The things most underestimated often matter the most. The German High Command had invested their faith in grand strategies, miracle weapons, and sweeping offensives. They dismissed the Havoc as a sideshow. Yet when the dust settled, it was precisely this kind of sideshow that had eroded their strength night after night until nothing remained but rubble and surrender. The lesson is both simple and cruel. In war, arrogance kills not only men but strategies. The Havoc demonstrated that persistence outweighs spectacle, that attrition can be as decisive as annihilation, and that the enemy's laughter is often the surest sign of their blindness. If the Reich had learned humility earlier, perhaps they might have respected the threat. But they did not, and so their sneer became their epitaph. For the Allies, the Havoc remains proof that practicality triumphs over prestige. It was not glamorous like the B-17, nor elegant like the Mosquito. But it was available, reliable, and mercilessly effective. When history debates the morality of carpet bombing, the Havoc stands quietly apart. It did not annihilate cities, it dismantled supply chains. It is difficult to question its efficiency, and even harder to dismiss its impact. And so the A-20 Havoc teaches us something beyond military doctrine. It reminds us that the overlooked, the ordinary, the mocked, can change the course of events if they persist. In life as in war, the nuisance unacknowledged is often the one that proves fatal. That is a lesson as relevant in boardrooms and politics as it is in battlefields. It is also why stories like this deserve to be told, not only of the glamorous machines that dominate documentaries, but of the humble ones that truly did the work. Because if we forget the Havoc, we risk forgetting that history is shaped not just by the lions but also by the mosquitoes. And here, perhaps, is where you and I must part ways for tonight. But if you've stayed with this story, if you've felt the irony in Berlin's laughter and the persistence of the Havoc's engines, I invite you to stay for more. Our channel exists to tell these forgotten tales, the ones too often hidden in the shadows of bigger names. Subscribe, join us, and you'll find not just history, but the echoes of voices that generals ignored, the machines that were mocked, and the lessons still relevant today. Because this is not merely the story of an aircraft. It is the story of arrogance undone, of persistence rewarded, and of a war shaped by the underestimated. If that kind of history speaks to you, then stay with us. There are more corridors to walk, more echoes to follow, more ironies to uncover. And together, we'll make sure that the laughter of the arrogant never drowns out the quiet truth of the persistent. The Havoc may not sit in every museum, but it sits in history's ledger. The generals sneered. The soldiers bled. The nuisance became the nightmare. And the lesson remains eternal. Never underestimate the mosquito.